John sat in the old, creaking armchair by the window, staring out at the stillness of the world outside. The streets were empty, devoid of any sign of life. No cars, no people, not even a stray animal wandering by. It was as if the earth had exhaled one final breath and then stopped. He couldn't remember how long it had been like this. Days blurred into nights, nights into weeks, and weeks into something even less tangible. At first there had been sounds, sirens wailing, the distant screams of people in panic, helicopters slicing through the sky. But now, it was nothing but silence. The kind of silence that gnawed at his sanity, that made him question if there had ever been a world outside of this dead, quiet shell. John glanced over at the radio on the table. It was his last connection to something. The batteries were dying, and all it emitted now was a faint crackle, like the echo of voices too far away to hear. He grabbed it, pressed the button, and spoke into the static. "Is anyone out there?" His voice cracked with desperation, though he had asked the same question countless times. There was no answer, just the low hum of static. He put the radio down and exhaled heavily, his chest tight with the weight of isolation. John's mind kept drifting back to Amy. Her face haunted him, her wide, fearful eyes on the last day he had seen her. He remembered the smell of disinfectant, the stench of panic in the air. She had held his hand, her grip weak and trembling. "Don't leave me," she had whispered, her voice barely audible over the chaos. But then she was gone, taken by the same thing that had taken everyone else. The virus, some mysterious disease that spread like wildfire, consuming everything. Amy was gone just like all the others, or so the world would have him believe. But John didn't believe that. Amy was still alive. He could feel it. She was out there somewhere, trying to reach him. She had to be. He picked up his phone, the screen cracked and dirty from months of wear. Every day he would call her. Every day he would leave her messages, hoping, no, knowing, that one day she would respond. And then, one day, she did. Ding! The sound startled him. It had been so long since his phone had made any noise at all that for a moment he wasn't sure what had just happened. His hands trembled as he unlocked the phone and stared at the screen. There it was. A text message. From Amy. "I'm okay, don't worry. I'll be home soon." John's breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded in his chest, an explosion of hope surging through his veins. He read the message again, and again, until the words blurred before his eyes. She was alive. Amy was alive. Suddenly, the apartment didn't feel so suffocating anymore. The walls seemed less close, less oppressive. John stood up, clutching the phone tightly, as if it were a lifeline. Everything made sense now. Amy was out there. She had survived. She was coming back to him. But how? Where was she? And why hadn't she contacted him sooner? The questions buzzed in his head, but they didn't matter. Not now. Not when the only thing that mattered was that Amy was still alive. For the first time in what felt like years, John smiled. A small, cracked smile, but it was real. He grabbed the old photo of Amy from the shelf, her smiling face frozen in time. His fingers brushed over the glass. "I knew you were still out there," he whispered, almost laughing. The world outside might have been lost, but inside this apartment, inside his mind, there was hope again. He was no longer alone. Amy was alive, and soon they would be together again. Or so he thought. The message from Amy gave John a new sense of purpose. He could no longer stay trapped in the suffocating walls of his apartment. If Amy was out there, he had to find her. There was no more time to waste. He dressed in layers, an old jacket, heavy boots, and gloves. The temperature had dropped in recent weeks, as if the world itself was growing cold with the absence of humanity. John stuffed a flashlight and a knife into his backpack, more for comfort than real protection. He wasn't sure what he would find out there, but he had a vague idea of the dangers. He had spent countless nights staring out of his window, watching shadows move in the dark. As he opened the door to his apartment, the familiar musty air of the hallway greeted him. It had been weeks, maybe even months, since he'd last ventured beyond his own front door. The apartment complex, once alive with the sounds of neighbors, barking dogs, and children playing, was now a graveyard of silence. John descended the stairs slowly, each creak of the steps echoing through the empty building. The front door of the building groaned as he pushed it open, and the icy wind hit his face like a slap. Outside, the city was a ghost of what it once was. The streets were littered with debris, abandoned cars, overturned garbage cans, and broken windows. Every sign of life was now just a memory. "Amy," he whispered, as if saying her name aloud would make her appear. John walked carefully, each step deliberate, as if the world outside was fragile and could collapse beneath him at any moment. He scanned the streets, looking for any sign of life. But there was nothing. The only sound was the occasional gust of wind rattling the abandoned remnants of what had once been a bustling city. He knew the world had changed, but this felt wrong. More than just empty. It felt dangerous. His mind conjured images of what might have caused the devastation. Monsters, infected humans, or worse, the unknown. It had been so long since he had seen another person that his imagination had filled in the blanks with horrors he could barely describe. He turned the corner and saw a figure in the distance. John's heart leapt into his throat. Someone else? Could it be Amy? The figure was standing at the edge of the street, its back turned to him. It was too far away to make out any details, but it was clearly human, or at least it seemed to be. John's pulse quickened, and for a moment, hope flared inside him. Maybe he wasn't alone after all. "Hey!" John called out, his voice cracking from disuse. The figure didn't move. It stood perfectly still, as if frozen in place. John called out again, louder this time. "Hey! Can you hear me?" Still nothing. His chest tightened with fear. Something about the way the figure stood, unmoving, was deeply unsettling. But it was the first sign of life, any life, that he had seen in so long. He couldn't just turn back now. John took a deep breath and approached cautiously. His footsteps echoed against the cracked pavement. The figure remained motionless, its back still facing him. As he got closer, he could see that it was a man, dressed in tattered clothes. But something was wrong. The man's body was too still, unnaturally so. John's instincts screamed at him to turn around, to run, but he forced himself to step closer. "Sir?" John's voice was a hushed whisper now, barely audible over the wind. Suddenly, without warning, the man's head jerked to the side, his face twisted into an unnatural angle. Black, lifeless eyes stared back at John, unblinking. John stumbled back, his heart pounding in his ears. The figure didn't move. But those eyes, they were empty, void of anything human. It was like staring into a doll's eyes, vacant and soulless. Then, without a sound, the man collapsed. His body crumpled to the ground as if all the life had drained out of him in an instant. John froze. His entire body tensed, every nerve on high alert. What the hell just happened? He wanted to run, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. He forced himself to breathe, to think, to move. Slowly, he took a few steps backward, his eyes never leaving the body. The city was dead. Everything in it was dead. But Amy was still out there. He couldn't let this stop him. John turned and ran, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He didn't stop until he reached the next street, his legs burning from the sudden burst of energy. He collapsed against a wall, clutching his chest as his heartbeat hammered in his ears. As the adrenaline began to fade, he realized how foolish he had been. The world outside wasn't just empty. It was hostile. Whatever was out here, it wasn't human. At least not anymore. But Amy had texted him. She was alive. He pulled out his phone and stared at the message again, the words blurring in front of his eyes. "I'll be home soon." John took a deep breath and looked around. He had to keep going. He had to find her. But as he stood up, he heard a noise. A faint, eerie sound that made his blood run cold. John. His name whispered on the wind. He turned sharply, his heart skipping a beat. There was no one there. The street was empty. And yet, he could swear that voice, Amy's voice, was calling out to him. John. The voice was faint but unmistakable, carried on the cold wind. Was it real? Or was his mind finally starting to crack under the pressure of isolation? John clenched his fists and shook his head. No, he wasn't crazy. Amy was out there somewhere. She had to be. He pushed forward, ignoring the creeping sense of dread that was slowly taking root in his chest. He wouldn't stop. Not until he found her. Not until he brought her back. Because if Amy was gone, then what was left? John moved through the city like a man possessed. The world around him had become a blur of empty streets, decaying buildings, and shadows that seemed to shift in the corners of his vision. Every step felt heavier than the last, but he forced himself to keep going, clutching his phone tightly in his hand, as if it were the last connection to reality. Amy was out there. He just had to find her. But the further he went, the more the city felt wrong. The silence wasn't just oppressive. It was alive. It wrapped around him, whispering things he didn't want to hear. You're alone. She's gone. His breath quickened as the thoughts swirled in his mind, his pace slowing with each passing moment. He couldn't stop thinking about the figure he had seen earlier, the lifeless man whose eyes were devoid of any humanity. Was that what had become of the people outside? Was that Amy's fate? No, he muttered to himself, shaking the thought away. Amy's alive. She's still alive. As he rounded a corner, he found himself standing in front of a park. The once lush green space was now overgrown with weeds, the benches toppled and broken. The playground equipment sat eerily still, rusted from months of disuse. It was a place he and Amy used to come often, back when life was normal. They would sit on one of those benches, drinking coffee, talking about everything and nothing. John's chest tightened. This was the spot. The very place where they had shared their last conversation, just days before the world fell apart. It was supposed to be a normal day, a quick outing before the lockdown started. But the memory was hazy, as if his mind couldn't fully grasp the details. Suddenly his phone buzzed in his hand, dragging him from his thoughts. Ding! His heart skipped a beat. A new message. He glanced down at the screen, and his pulse quickened. It was from Amy. I'm close. Please hurry. John's eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat. She was nearby. She was close enough to send him a message. His body trembled with a mixture of relief and fear. He scanned the park, looking for any sign of her, but the place was as empty as ever. Where are you? He muttered under his breath, his voice barely a whisper. He typed a quick response, his fingers shaking. Amy, where are you? I'm in the park. I'm waiting for you. He sent the message and stared at the phone, waiting, hoping. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. His heart pounded in his chest, the silence around him becoming unbearable. And then, ding! Turn around! John froze. His breath hitched, and his body went rigid. Slowly, almost mechanically, he turned around. His eyes scanned the park, looking for her. But there was no one. Amy! He called out, his voice cracking. His pulse was racing, panic creeping into his veins. Amy, where are you? The wind picked up, rustling the branches of the overgrown trees, but there was no answer. Suddenly, he heard footsteps behind him, a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves. He spun around, his eyes wide, and there, standing at the edge of the park, was a figure. It was a woman. Her back turned to him, her hair long and dark, swaying in the wind. Amy? John's voice trembled as he took a step toward her, but she didn't move. He felt a surge of fear rise in his chest. Something about the way she stood there perfectly still made his skin crawl. It was like the man he had seen earlier, too still, too quiet. Amy! John called out louder, trying to mask the panic in his voice. He took another step forward. "Is that you?" Slowly, the woman began to turn around. John's heart leapt into his throat. His mind raced with conflicting emotions: hope, fear, dread. And then she faced him. John stumbled back, his eyes wide in horror. It was Amy, or at least, it looked like her. But her skin was pale, almost translucent, her eyes dark and hollow. Her lips twisted into a grotesque smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. There was something wrong with her face. It was distorted, like a mask that had been warped and stretched over something inhuman. "John." Her voice was a low, haunting whisper, her lips barely moving. "I've been waiting for you." His body went numb, and a wave of nausea washed over him. This wasn't Amy. It couldn't be. But her voice. It was her voice, wasn't it? "No." John's voice broke, his hands shaking violently. "This isn't real!" But the figure, Amy, just stood there, her eerie smile never fading. Her eyes, black and empty, bore into him unblinking. "Come with me, John. It's time to go home." John stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own feet. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body felt frozen, paralyzed by fear. "Amy." "No," he whispered, tears welling up in his eyes. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. This wasn't her. It couldn't be her. The figure began to move toward him, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she was gliding across the ground. "Come home, John." Her voice was more insistent now, louder, echoing in his head. "Come with me, come with me." John backed away, his heart racing, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He turned and ran, his feet pounding against the pavement as he fled the park, the image of Amy's twisted face seared into his mind. He didn't stop running until he reached the outskirts of the city, where the streets turned to barren fields of overgrown grass and crumbling buildings. His lungs burned, his legs screamed in protest, but he kept going, driven by sheer terror. Finally, he collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, his mind reeling. He stared down at his phone, the screen cracked and smudged with dirt. The last message from Amy still glowed faintly on the screen. "I'm close. Please hurry." John's hand shook as he dropped the phone to the ground. The reality of what had just happened crashed over him like a wave. Amy was dead. She had been dead for months. He knew that. Deep down, he had always known that. But then why? Why had she contacted him? Why had he seen her, heard her voice? His mind spiraled with confusion, fear gnawing at the edges of his sanity. Was he losing his grip on reality? Had the isolation finally driven him mad? He stared out at the horizon, the cold wind whipping through the empty streets. Was there anyone left, or had he always been alone? John closed his eyes, his breath hitching in his throat. Maybe Amy was gone, but he wasn't ready to let her go. Not yet. John lay on the cold ground, his mind racing, struggling to make sense of what had happened. The image of Amy, warped, distorted, but so real, still burned in his mind. He knew something was wrong with him. That much was clear. The isolation, the silence. It had been eating away at him for months. He had hoped so desperately that Amy was alive, but that hope had twisted into something far darker. He sat up slowly, his body aching, his breath still shaky. The world around him was quiet, painfully so, and for a moment he considered staying right where he was, giving up. Maybe it would be easier to just let go, to stop fighting. After all, what was left for him? But then the phone buzzed again. Ding! John's head snapped down to the ground where his phone lay. The screen flickered faintly, as if struggling to stay alive. With trembling hands, he picked it up and stared at the new message. "John, I'm waiting." It was from Amy. A deep sense of dread settled over him. He knew logically that this couldn't be real. Amy was dead. She had been dead for months. He had seen the chaos, the bodies, the way the virus had swept through the city, leaving nothing but death in its wake. There was no way she could be sending these messages. And yet, she was. The phone was buzzing in his hand. Her words were right there, clear as day. He stood up, shakily, and looked around. The landscape was desolate. Buildings collapsed into themselves, overgrown vegetation creeping across the streets. But there, in the distance, he saw something. A figure, standing still, waiting. It was her, Amy. John's breath hitched, his heart pounding in his chest. No, this couldn't be real. He had run from her, fled from that horrifying version of her. But now she was here again, waiting for him, just as she always had been. John. Her voice echoed across the empty streets. A soft, haunting whisper carried on the wind. He didn't move. His body was paralyzed by the conflict raging in his mind. Was this real? Was Amy truly there? Or was his mind playing tricks on him again? He took a tentative step forward, then another. The figure remained, unmoving. With each step, his emotions whirled, a mix of terror, hope, and desperation. The closer he got, the more certain he became that it was Amy. It had to be. She was standing just a few feet away now, her back turned to him, her long dark hair blowing gently in the wind. "Amy," he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't respond. His mind screamed at him to stop, to turn around, but his heart told him to go to her. He needed to see her, to be sure. "Please, turn around," John begged, his voice cracking with emotion. Slowly, the figure began to turn, just like before. John's stomach twisted with fear, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. When she finally faced him, his heart shattered. It was Amy, but not the Amy he remembered. Her face was gaunt, her skin pale and drawn tight over her bones. Her eyes, once full of life, were dark, empty voids. The smile that stretched across her face was grotesque, a parody of the woman he had once loved. "John." Her voice was soft, almost tender, as if she were comforting him. "You can be with me now. We can be together again." John staggered backward, shaking his head in disbelief. "No, you're not real. You're dead." Amy, or whatever this thing was, took a step toward him, her smile never faltering. "You've been so alone, John. But you don't have to be anymore. We can go home together." His hands trembled as he raised the phone again, staring at the messages. They had to be fake, right? Just hallucinations. But they looked so real. He felt like he was sinking, deeper and deeper into a pit he couldn't climb out of. The boundaries between what was real and what wasn't had blurred completely. "Amy, I can't do this anymore," John whimpered, his voice breaking. His mind was collapsing under the weight of everything, the isolation, the fear, the crushing loneliness. Amy, the thing, reached out her hand toward him, her dark eyes locking onto his. "Come with me, John. There's nothing left for you here. This world is gone, but I'm still here." John's breath hitched. His world, the one he thought he understood, was crumbling. He looked around at the desolation, the emptiness. Maybe she was right. Maybe there was nothing left. Slowly he reached out, his hand trembling, fingertips brushing hers. The moment their skin touched, a cold, numbing sensation shot through his body. It wasn't the warmth of Amy's touch he remembered. It was something wrong. Suddenly a voice broke through the haze. "John!" It was sharp, urgent, coming from somewhere behind him. John spun around, startled. In the distance he saw a group of people, real people, running toward him. They were shouting, waving their arms, trying to get his attention. "John, get away from her!" one of them yelled, his voice panicked. John's heart raced. The group grew closer, and now he could see them more clearly. Men and women, their faces weathered but alive. They weren't figments of his imagination. They were survivors, like him. "Come with us! She's not real!" one of the men called out, his voice trembling with urgency. John looked back at Amy, her dark, hollow eyes staring into his soul. Her smile remained, but now it seemed even more twisted, as if she knew she was losing him. "Don't listen to them, John. They're lying. I'm the only one who's real." His mind screamed in confusion. He looked back and forth between the group of survivors and Amy. His heart wanted to believe her, wanted to hold on to the hope that she was still alive. But deep down, he knew. He knew what was real. John tore his hand away from hers, stumbling backward. "No, you're not real. You're not Amy." Amy's smile faltered, her face twisting in anger and something far darker. "You'll never escape me, John." Her voice was no longer soft and comforting. It was cold, malevolent. But John didn't care anymore. He turned and ran toward the survivors, his legs feeling like they would give out at any moment. As he reached them, one of the women grabbed his arm, pulling him along. "Come on! We need to get out of here!" As they ran, John glanced back. Amy, or whatever she had been, was gone, swallowed by the shadows of the dead city. Hours later, John sat in a makeshift shelter with the group of survivors. They offered him food, water, and warmth. But as they spoke to him, telling him how they had survived the outbreak, how they had been searching for others, John's mind wandered. He knew he was safe now. He was surrounded by real people. But no matter how much he tried to convince himself, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. As he stared into the fire, the crackling flames casting long shadows across the walls, he thought he heard her voice again. "John." The shadows shifted, and for a split second, he swore he saw Amy's face in the flickering light. "You'll never escape me." And deep down, John knew that no matter how far he ran, no matter how many people he found, he would never truly be free.